thank you very much for coming out of your warm houses to join us tonight, and I hope that we will warm your hearts with progress on your research tonight. All right, so this is the schedule for tomorrow. There's one more one-on-one session scheduled for the 13th of June. So if anybody wants a space for then, you must please come and talk to me. There's still quite a number of spaces left. So that's next week, Thursday. All right.
Is that one full for tomorrow?
There's one session open at 9:30, but I don't know, maybe, I don't know, Ria, do you want to take, okay. So 9:30, if you want 9:30. Okay, your surname is? Masemale, like that. Okay, cool. So, and department? Masename. Oh, sorry. Masename, like that. M-A-S-E-L-A-N.
Back. Kom tot bij L, meer L, meer E.
Masina, N-A-M-E-L-A.
Oh, A. Sorry. Okay, so you will then be at 9:30. All right. Okay, so this is the tomorrow's sessions, and then the 13th of June there's sessions. Yes.
There's a second session now that we have to.
No, this is still the same session.
It's still the same, so
Yeah.
not being in
Yeah, well, you can come again if you want. If a lot of people have been for more than one session. This is tomorrow morning. Or tomorrow the whole day. From 9 until 3. And then there's one next week Thursday again. So there are still spaces there. So if you need a space, come and talk to me. All right. Okay, then, guys, I sent you a survey because we are going to now appoint people to man the lab, or to woman the lab, whatever you want to call it. And but now the question is, you know, what is the need? So I've basically sent you a SurveyMonkey questionnaire, and please fill it in and tell me what times you will be using the lab. Because the more I've got of that, the bigger the chance is that we're going to have the lab open for longer periods. Okay. So the lab will be open, but now it's a question of how many hours. All right. So please weigh in and give us your feedback. All right. Then, as you all know, your abstracts had to be in today. The important thing is that you must find out from your department when the druk dates are. Okay, so let me quickly.
First pass your supervisor.
Yeah.
Remember, your supervisor has to feel happy with this one.
Yes, because your the process is that your abstract has to go to your supervisor, and your supervisor will then submit it to the druk. But it's important that you have in mind that the druk also has a closing date for when the abstract must be in, because people must read the abstract, and then it has to go to the FHDC for the 1st of August, and the closing date for that agenda is the 19th of July. Right, so you can see the druk will be before then. So most of the druks will probably be in that week from the 15th to the 19th. But that still means that you have to submit before that. Okay, so please just check that and make sure that your abstract is in before the druk so that you can have it approved at the 1st of August FHDC. Because that's really what we want to do. Okay, is everyone happy with that? Right. So I will now, without further ado, hand over to Ria, and she will tell you nice things.
Okay, guys. How has the last week been?
Stressful.
I find it quite interesting that most of the people that are here today are the ones that are actually progressing quite well. We have had fun and games this last 2-3 weeks. We went through all of the detail. Okay, who have not been spoken to over the last 2 weeks?
Who hasn't been grilled?
Who hasn't been grilled? Who didn't arrive for grilling? Okay. Oh. Okay. But I think you all know that what is going to happen at those grillings, even if you've done exceptionally well, you will be moved forward a little bit. This being moved forward may appear that we're actually still not happy with this. It doesn't mean that we're still not happy. It just means that we are moving it forward so that you can become a little bit better. So out of here, who of you are feeling comfortable? Who of you had the 150 words accepted? Nobody yet here. Okay, you've had yours accepted, nobody else. Who feels that their 150 words have a very good chance of being accepted by their supervisors very, very soon? Okay. You need to take it to your supervisor. You need to go and discuss it with your supervisor. The actual reality is that your supervisors will be expecting that thing to be much more precise than what they would have expected somebody to do it from the start, because they've now already walked a while with you and they want you to reflect it. But the requirement is basically that it should be a one-pager, okay? And that's quite challenging, to try and restrain everything that you know now onto one page. It means that you've got to be very, very precise. You've got to get it past your supervisors so that your supervisor is comfortable, because your supervisor is actually the person that presents it to the DRIC. That's okay. Who of you have not yet got your research problem down precisely, one sentence? Okay. She had a very, very bad, and you have been seeing me when last? Oh, I think next week we want another appointment, okay? I think you need to come. And in your case, I understand exactly. She's having a topic float at the moment. But your neighbor, why is your problem not yet fixed?
Actually, I've done, based on your whatever, I've been able to do some corrections. So
You're busy. You're in the process. It's not yet. But all of you are getting to that problem. It is very important to know that if you don't have your problem precisely, the rest of the process won't work. The key, and I've showed you those diagrams over and over, the key to good research is a very precisely defined research problem. Although the problem that you talk about, your problem area, is much wider, you have to be very clear about what problem you are actually going to be basing your research on. Substantiating, we've been speaking about it. It's got to be substantiated from the literature. It's got to be substantiated from practice. Some of you are working on the literature parts. Some of you are working on the practice parts. Okay. All of you seem to be reading. Who of you are not yet comfortable with the reading part of it? Still struggling with it? No, you are uncomfortable with the reading part because you're reading too much. You now have to just refine. The problem is when you start reading and you haven't got your research problem precisely defined, it's very difficult to focus your reading. What's happening with her is that she's working in a topic area of ergonomics. Who of you think you know what ergonomics is? You've got to, it's... There's a number of issues. The work distance is about how people fit into the places where they work and live. Okay? So if you look at that, it sounds simple. Sometimes some people understand it to be, can I reach that? How big am I? Can I fit? And it always used to be in the aircraft that aerostesses were chosen to be a certain height and a certain width, okay, so that they can actually fit there and other people at the same time. This has now changed, but at least the pilots are still carefully measured that they can fit into that area. If you look at the whole issue of finding shoes, there's a whole lot of ergonomic work being done in making sure that we find shoes that we like and can fit in. Of course, the height of the shoes don't necessarily have a lot of ergonomics in that. And in clothes, just finding jeans. Do you know how much research is being done into how to shape jeans so that people actually fit into them, as opposed to some dolls? So there's a lot of that, but there's also the aspect of the psychological environment and everything like that. It's a wide area, and what she's found out recently is exactly how wide that area is. And for a lot of you, when you start reading, you may be finding out those things. I think you also found out that what seemed to be a pretty straightforward problem in the beginning, when you start unpacking the literature behind it, it's not quite so straightforward. There's a lot more to it than you thought. So everybody that has not yet been moved forward and be explained how many degrees you're trying to achieve here, you'll be focused, systematically focused down so that you can actually get 1 degree. And it's not a comfortable situation. Okay? It's not very pleasant. It is painful because you become precious about what you write. How many hours have you spent writing those 2 pages? How close is this to your heart? How unhappy do you feel if I take out a red pen and go, it's not very nice, isn't it? But it's a process that we want you to go through because we want you to have a research proposal that you can go and execute and not having to go back several times during the process of doing the research. So in that cycle, and we'll get to that again, we are working slowly towards that.
Sorry, Ria, can I just say something?
Yeah.
Which I forgot.
Yeah.
For those of you that are worried that you only have 6 months to do your proposal and your 6 months are now running out, etc., please don't worry. We have approval to extend the proposal process. So everybody expects the proposal only to be ready by the end of August. And in the progress report, there will be progress reflected because you have done assignments. So it's not as if suddenly, you have to submit a progress report and you haven't done anything. And it's acceptable and it's accepted, and I will send an email to the students and the supervisors to that effect. So please don't worry, just work on your proposals.
Okay, so what we're going to do today is pretty much the same that we did on session 4 on the 18th of April. But we hope that people will be more able to take it on board because you now have a good idea of where your problem is and where your primary research question is. Okay. This is a recap, but we're going to deal with some things. And it's around, okay, we're not doing assignment 2. You remember that? We're not resubmitting assignment 2. We assume that you are actually reading. If we go through the model, and you've seen this over and over, most of you have now dealt with your problem area. You've actually found your research question. Some of you are still refining around there. Okay? Remember, if you've done your proposal appropriately, decently, you would have done most of your chapter 1 of your research, your final document, your thesis or your dissertation. So this is not something in isolation. And we work and continuing your support so that you can actually get to the point that your chapter 1 will be easy. There's some of you that currently have to do a little bit more about getting to the point, arguing your problem. Some need to support a little bit more. But I think most of you are on your way to get here. We've discussed over and over why the research problem is at the heart of everything. And if we continue nagging about your research problem being precise and actually focus on one research project, exactly for that time. We don't want you to waste. There are some of you that may be busy with changing your titles, okay? It seems to be, if you start changing your title and your area, you have to resubmit 150 word, not 150 page. Okay. If you change it significantly. Have you got your 150?
Well, I've submitted for the first one and it got approved, but now I've changed the research area because they were very skeptical that I would find monkeys that I'm not actually supposed to see.
Yeah, everybody, I think, we've dealt with the ethical access. Many of you found out that what you thought were great research problems was not seen as desirable to be researched by everybody else. Okay, so if you basically have to rephrase your 150 words.
But the topic, it's still the same. It's
But
just in a...
To what extent?
Because actually what was happening, I'm doing on employee wellness programs.
Yeah.
So the previous 20 municipality, they had that in place. And now I'm doing my research on FSB, the Financial Service Board, and they also do have the wellness in place. So
Yeah.
what I'm trying to measure is just the effectiveness of the program.
Okay, to what extent does she then have to resubmit 100?
If your title has changed,
My title hasn't changed.
then you don't have to resubmit your abstract. Because it's only if you have a title change that you have to fill in the form.
But your title must reflect your research problem.
Yeah.
So many people that have now refined your research problem may want to
Yeah. So for those of you that have had your 150 abstracts approved, and you've now changed to such an extent that the title of your research has changed, all you do is you resubmit that 150-word proposal, and your supervisor will then just put it in as change of title. That's all you do. So it's a bit of paperwork, but let's rather do the paperwork now than later.
Okay, so your research problem will affect your title. As you get more specific about it, it may just start to change a little bit around that. It is very important that you make sure that the words you use in the title are actually the same words that you have in your problem, or actually the same words that you have in your research question, your primary research question. It sounds ridiculous, but just go and check that you actually have it, and that you actually have a very, very good idea of what you mean by that word. As we've tried to explain about ergonomics, it may sound to be a straightforward word. Just what is actually meant by that word. You will be exploring that in your conceptualization part of your proposal, but it's really quite critical. And I don't want you to find out a little bit too late that somehow you've forgotten to change a word here and there. We now want to get to the bottom here where we actually have our structured problem. So overall, we've gone over this over and over and over. If you've got a thorough research proposal, the rest is just filling in and painting by numbers. It is cyclical. You are not going to finish off anything and get it done and dusted until such time as you have your whole thesis or your whole dissertation done and dusted. You will be updating all the time as you're carrying on. While you're updating, just making sure that the alignment stays the same, that you don't change some words, say in some of your research sub-questions or your hypothesis, and this is not reflected all the time, because we want that golden thread to go through all the way. And all this fiddling is about making sure that in the end you have the golden thread. Okay. So let's recap on what the research, what the structuring process is. Now keep your own primary research question in your mind. Your primary research question is the question that you have phrased within your research problem. And even your research problem, you may ask a number of questions there. So the way that you state your primary research question is really very important. If you've stated a primary research question and you do all of this analysis and you find out that you struggle to actually work out how you're going to do the research, you may want to go back and phrase a little bit different. So some of you might have done assignment 3 already. Just go back and make sure that you've done it correctly. Okay. So fundamentally what this says is that when you have your primary research question, you unpack this to find out what anybody can ask. And you've all sat there when I take out the document and pull my glasses over my nose and try and work out how many holes I can shoot in your argument. And that's literally what I do. I sit there deliberately trying to unpick your arguments when you're there. Because if I cannot unpick it, then the chances are fairly good that your examiner will also not be able to unpick it. So I'm going through there and I'm looking for weaknesses. It's not because I particularly dislike you. It's because I do like you. I want to make sure that there's no weakness in there. But what you can do to make sure there's no weakness is to make sure that you ask any possible question that any reader may have about your research. So you do not want your examiner to say anything nasty. If you have a viva, if you are actually going to go out and present, you don't want anybody there to say anything nasty, and you don't, at the doctoral level, want anybody to say anything nasty about the publications that come out of there. So systematically, this process say that if I've got my primary question, what question can anybody ask in there? Because you do not know who precisely that nasty little person on the other side of the red pen in your examining panel will be, you can't actually imagine everything. So there's a certain amount of blindness in the way that you're trying to get these questions. And you have to go out of your way to make sure that you've actually taken all of the possible questions. The way you do that is by asking people, what can you see in there? Your supervisor can look at it. Look at other academics. Look at your colleagues, your friends in this class. What would they see in there? Because we don't want that. So the first filter is that blind filter. And we'll talk about it again. Then you're going to make decisions saying, okay, good grief. If people can ask this kind of question in my research, but it's outside of what I think my scope should be, you make a decision about it. It can possibly be there. I'm not going to do it. So all that I do is when I make my scope or my delineation, I state this. It's out of my scope so that nobody can ask me about this question. I told you I'm not going to look at it. Okay. So, and then you're starting to say, okay, now let us unpack this. Let's analyze it and we're going to talk about it, and then you make a decision. From this decision you can decide, yes, I'm going to do this research. I'm actually going to answer this question. Preferably the easiest way is to find literature to answer it. Okay? I'm just going to analyze it in my literature review, which is chapter 2. I'm going to go through this and I'm going to provide a substantiated argument. These guys say this is weak, analyze it, critically analyze it, and say, for the purposes of my study, not quite those words, this is what the literature say about it. And I have an answer or part of my argument. If I can't do that, and I'm going to answer it, I have to find evidence to actually answer this question. If you want to find evidence, it means that it's empiric question, or what most people would see as your research questions. But it's your research sub-questions. It may be, and we'll get to that again, that you find 8 sub-questions popping out there. That is not acceptable. You are doing 1 degree. So the guidelines is between 3 and 5. Okay. At a master's level, you want to be 3 and possibly even 2. At the doctoral level, you're going to look at a bit higher. Okay. So you don't want to have too many answers that you think that you're going to do, because it's unnecessary. So when you have too many, you just go back and say, okay, this one I'm not going to answer. This is going to become be delineated out, or be a limitation, or I'm just going to make an assumption around it, because I cannot answer every possible question in there. But that's based on your decision after you've thought about it, written it down, and had guidance from your supervisor, or when you have multiple supervisors, from your supervisor. You might also decide, I'm not going to do this question. If I'm not going to answer this question, it may be because there's some literature, okay, and I am just going to make an assumption. I'm going to say something like, for the purposes of this study, the answer of this question will be the following, and I have some evidence. Typically, definitions tend to be there. There are many definitions. Each one of that little words that's in, or your concepts that's in your title, in your question, have a definition, okay? Have any of you taken all the textbooks and see how exactly precisely the definition is always the same? It's not the same. This guy sees it a little bit like this, and this guy sees it a little bit like that. And you talk about this professional organization, they see this. There's many definitions out there. So in your literature, you must say, I am not going to analyze all of this. I'm not going to really engage with this and do this work. It's just too much. I am actually working from this definition, but you've got to state it. Or I am assuming that people, if this happens, the following will happen. I'm just assuming it, and I have some literature to back my assumption up. You can't make an assumption if you have no evidence to base this on. It may not be complete evidence, but there's some. Some of these questions could come out, and you will not be able to answer that because there's no literature, and you can't go around answering it empirically. Some of your ethical issues, concerns, questions might be there. Then this becomes a limitation to your study. I cannot say the following things. Your limitations come from 3 points. It's where you have phrased your questions, it's based on your research design, and it's based on the responses and the analysis of your data. So your ability to answer the question that you phrase, your primary research question, is limited, not delineated outside the scope, is limited by your ability to find certain answers. Okay. First from your answers, then I have chosen this research methodology. It may be, it's a qualitative thing, it's very valid, but there are some possible issues about its reliability, so I cannot give you generalizability figures, because I can't do that. That's just a limitation. Doesn't mean it's not suitable research. You have to understand that limitation. So we're going to talk about limitation as well when we're dealing with the design. And when I get all the results, I analyze it and I find that there's some answers I can't give. That's also a limitation.
So, sorry, Dr. Ria. So what you're saying is just, well, in my case, I also don't have a universal definition of employee wellness. Everybody defines it on their own. So I would be just correct if maybe I had to quote from one person to say, okay, employee wellness in this study refers to this.
Yeah,
and that,
but you have to acknowledge that there are multiple definitions. So basically, with any assumption, you say that this is not a clear-cut answer. We don't have complete evidence to make anything for the purposes, and you might argue that slightly. This is what, in her case, she has to deal with ergonomics for disabled people, so she will be really saying that from this ergonomics in the workplace environment, we're going to look at these things only. So you make a decision on that, but you've got to substantiate that choice.
So I was thinking, I don't know if I'm correct, I was thinking in an essence where I'll say employee wellness in this? Okay, well, I would definitely have to just state that there's no universal definition of it.
And you can,
And then
yeah.
I just list a few definitions, different, and then from
Okay.
different people, and then after I can say in the study I'll be focusing
Okay.
on this.
When you're making assumption about the exact meaning about one of your variables, you've got to actually present those alternatives and do that. But it's not necessary for all your assumptions. When that thing is so fundamental, and you have to be able to say, this guy's definition is because they're working from this theoretical perspective or whatever. So you've got to argue that when it's so key to your research.
I think I'm also going through the same situation. I was just thinking, is it acceptable that I'll make a table also of
That-
definition?
that-
You know that.
Okay.
This one.
When you do a table and you're analyzing, okay, that is slightly different. What you're doing there is you're making it a literature question. And what you're doing is you're doing that and you're doing content analysis on what the definitions are. This one contains this one contains this one contains that. Now, if you construct your own definition, that's empirical research. Okay? If you decide on which one to take, that is literature research. Or you can make some empirical judgments on what to include based on the literature. But that kind of unpacking is quite useful if at a doctoral level it's certainly necessary. At a master's level you can still make a definition about any of your key variables in your study. At a doctoral level you will deal deeply with what the alternative views are and defining exactly why you choose yours. Master's level, you can say these and these and these. I'm using this definition. Okay. So the rules are slightly, the depth of engagement with the literature is more. Expected from a doctoral study is more. Okay. It's just one step further. So if you start looking at, let's unpack the process a little bit. Many of you have jumped to your research questions because instinctively you thought these were the appropriate research sub-questions. What's important is that going through this mechanistic process, because it's really do the following steps, you are just making sure that you've done all the checks and balances, and that it's possible for you to discuss this with your supervisor in an informed way. So your supervisor can see the logic that you thought and can actually say whether this works. So the depth of analysis here is to make sure that it's possible for you to do the research and that everybody's on the same page. We've spoken about that. Got your substantiated research process. The way you state your research question has still got some gray areas about it. It's more or less there. And now we are going to the next level. You start with the what is meant by every single term used in your research question. Don't assume anything. Okay. The blind filter, as we said, these are the things that you do not think of. Sometimes these are the things that your supervisor may not be thinking of. Okay? These are fundamental weaknesses in your argument. So the more you unpack that, the more certain you are that there is no weakness in there. So when you've unpacked those questions, just have a few other people also just look at the questions so that there's nothing else that they can come up with. It just makes your whole argument stronger. Okay. So, because otherwise you're assuming limitations, you're making assumptions because you don't know what you've done. We just want you to be aware of what you've done. There are no number of reasons why people don't ask. Sometimes it's because there is a certain inherent taboo in your mind you don't even think about this question because it is not the kind of question that you ask within your own culture. Okay. So because we don't talk about it in our culture doesn't mean that it's not a legitimate research question. So it's important to understand that. The next reason you may not think about it is because there is some block in your mind around ethical issues. It's just so unthinkable for you to ask certain questions that you don't ask them. So things that around, what's some of the things? If you want to know what do people actually do when they're in the toilets, okay, remember the whole thing about the toilets? You don't ask those questions. Are you going to put a camera? Just for you, the actual idea of putting a camera up there, ethically, everybody knows this is not quite the way to go. And because it's such a sensitive thing, you might not even think that this is a question. But in the research, you may want to say, we assume the following things happen. Or based on other research, we take the following. So just be very, very careful around that. Typically, ethical issues will lead to either assumptions or limitations in your study. Because if it's so bad ethically, people might not have done other studies. Then there are issues about your domain and your discipline. In marketing, people do not ask this kind of question. Okay. In the hospitality industry, people do not ask this kind of question. Unfortunately, your proposal and your final work is going through the faculty. So these questions might just be asked. And you don't know if your external examiner may have another background as well. So you cannot ever be sure that whoever is going to look at that is only looking at it from a very, very strict disciplinary perspective. So it is necessary to think about those as far as you can. Then there's a prevailing practice in the discipline. Very often the prevailing practice in the school of thought is influenced by the specific academics in your department. In the wider area of marketing, all these debates are going on. But the people that are here have got this viewpoint and this viewpoint and that viewpoint. And they don't make decisions. In psychology, I've recently gone through a process with some psychology students in UJ. If there's a fundamental viewpoint, they might not be looking at these other possible issues. But you don't know what's the school of thought of your examiner, of anybody that reads your work. So that might also be an issue. And then experienced. In my side, I'm sitting there with a sharp little thing and I'm going pick, 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 pick at all of your questions. And it's just because I've had experience about similar questions, so I know what could possibly be in there. So that's what you want to be also unpacking. So please be aware of the fact that you may be blind to some questions and try and be complete. Now you've got this whole list. I know we said you must unpack about 30. You might find that you need more. At a doctoral level, I would try and to become at least as complete as possible. And you'll find out that there's a mix of questions that are qualitative, mostly qualitative, that can be answered mostly qualitative, and some that can be answered quantitatively. If you have a question that can clearly be answered in both ways, analyze it separately so that you know how you want to answer it. Okay? And you've got this whole range of questions and you're going through this. Okay. Now you have to ask yourself certain things. Okay. The first one is a paucity filter. I nearly forgot about that, where you say, wow, this is interesting that somebody can think that this question exists here, but it's outside the scope of my research. The only way that you put it then is you go through that and you say, this is outside the scope. That's all you need to do. when you put down your scope and you actually say this is outside my scope, the delineations, I'm not going there. You don't actually have to even defend it as long as your supervisor agrees with you. So you're trying to get through that. And basically you're doing a Pareto principle. All of the rest of the analysis take a lot of time. What do you think is important enough for you to answer? And you must be honest. Now, okay, is it inside and outside? That's all with same thing and different one. Now you're going to look at the leftover questions and you're going to look at them seriously. The reason you look at them is because you want to find out if you actually can do this research. Is it practical to do this work? You don't want to start a research project and then find out at the end I can't answer it. Or find out that I'm asking questions in an area where access is such a sensitive matter that I won't be able to answer it. We want you to focus on things that is possible. You might see there's an extra line in there. I'll talk to that now. I've added an extra question in there for you that are working on assignment 3. You may want to put that in a question line and that in the table. I'll talk to it now. The first thing, this question, never mind what kind of research I want to do, is this a qualitative paradigm type of question or a quantitative paradigm? Quantitative typically deals with explain type of question. Qualitative typically deals with understand kind of questions. There's also certain protocol. If you use the word influence, for example, you might think you know exactly what is meant by influence. But in academia, that word is used in a precise way. So sometimes the words that you're asking, you might interpret it that it means this, but your supervisor or one of the nasty witches in the top will go and say, no, this word means something different. So it's quantitative. The next one is actually looking at this question carefully to see if there are potential ethical concerns in here. Okay. Once again, this will determine. Ethical concerns does not mean that you're going to not ask it. It might mean that you have to go around getting informed consent. Anything that you try and get from people will have some ethical issues in it. You need to get informed consent. There could be issues about people's privacy. There could be issues around people being hurt by it. And then you've got to be careful about what items you investigate. The next thing is, what is the theoretical grounding? Okay. It's easy to say there is literature, but what you really want to be doing there is to say what literature that you found so far deals with this. So putting a list of authors, putting a list of what topics it is being dealt, try and be very precise there, because this will enable you to make a judgment call if you can answer this from the literature or if you need more evidence. So what do people know about that? Also, if you want to get more evidence, you just can't go around and say, I want to go measure customer satisfaction. You actually have to know what things are the proxies, what are the things that I'm measuring as indicators of customer satisfaction. And to be able to go there, you have to have literature that tell you, I have to have these things. So if you don't have some grounding literature, it is very, very difficult to do empirical work there. Okay. So really telling yourself, and you've been reading far now, so you should know what can I actually answer around this question. The next question is, what form of data or evidence exists? Where is it? Is it in people's head? Is it annual reports? Is it evidence about how customers feel that are in customers' head? Or is there evidence in some records around the customer complaints? Where is that information that you can get? And very importantly is the next question, and that's a new question that I've put in there because I think it's important enough to be warranted. Do I have ethical access? Okay? Just because you know something doesn't mean that you actually have ethical access to it. You know what the reports say. You know what the dirty secrets inside your department, inside your organization is about it. But you do not have the access to that to use it in a research project. Okay. Very often, I mean, this one of a number of you are actually academics. Just because you work with the students doesn't mean you've got access to them and they have to answer everything you want to ask. So there's a difference between actually knowing it and being able to use it, and knowing exactly where it is and being able to ask those questions. So you've got to think about it carefully. And then, next question, are there instruments, are there surveys that, let's go back to the quality thing, am I going to use SurfQual? Where's my quality person? Not here. Or am I going to use another instrument? What exactly is it that I'm going to use? And if I have an instrument that works, okay, why on earth am I going to spend a long time designing it? And designing an instrument is not a matter of sitting in the bath and dreaming up questions to ask. You've got to ground every item in the literature. So if you can find an instrument, even if that instrument is purely the basis from which you work, that's good. If you can find in somebody's research, they've asked the following questions in the structured literature, the structured interviews, that's good. If you can find in somebody's work, then in an unstructured interview, they were looking at the following themes, that's good. So to what extent do you have one? And the next one, to what extent can you develop one? Because if you cannot find out what on earth is it that I need to measure, say for example, retention of customers. Okay? I cannot measure retention by asking them, do you intend to be retained? Okay? Because that's not retention. I have to actually go and measure evidence to say they were retained. So what is it that you're going to measure? What are the things that are actually indicators of the actual construct, the actual concept that you're measuring? So you've got to really, really deal with that. And then the next thing is, do I have the skills? Simple. Am I comfortable enough with statistics and understanding that to be able to do this? Say, for example, you want to go in deep interviews. Am I comfortable enough to have these long, intense interviews with a chief operating officer? Or am I too shy? Do I have those skills? Do I think that I can do an ethnographic study? Although we try and warn you away from things that take a long time, you may have to go there. Can I run a focus group? Okay. Running a focus group sounds straightforward. If you cannot control a group, it's gone. The facilitation of that group, not controlling them in terms of getting them to say what you want, but facilitating that group so that it functions appropriately. You can't do that. So being absolutely real about, do I have the skills and can I acquire those skills? Now, if you've been brutally honest with yourself, you are now able to make decisions. Okay, of course you take your supervisor through this as well, because your supervisor will give you some more input. You are going to decide, this is the answers I have. This is the decisions I make about the question. There's no right or wrong. Every single person doing the research will do it differently. Every single supervisor will advise you differently. I might go out and I tell them, go for this one. And somebody else might say, go for that one. It's your decision under the guidance of your supervisor or your supervisors. You might actually find if you have multiple supervisors, this is one of the exciting points where these decisions are made. And then you make these decisions. But now you know what and why are you making those decisions. You're not just making them because you think they're cool. And you can build this argument. Now please do not underestimate your ability or the necessity of working out how you're going to answer it. Am I asking the literature question and I use the literature and the sub-question to answer the next sub-question? Or are they following one after another? In what order do I have to answer these things to come up with a well-substantiated answer to my primary research question? And you've got to play around with that logic, because that logic is also going to guide you to how are you going to do your research methodology. If one of your questions is, what possible factors exist that may influence the decision of somebody to do something? It tells you that maybe that first question, and then it is how important are those? It tells you that possibly you're going to do some qualitative work, finding out what are the possible issues, looking at the literature, having some unstructured or semi-structured interviews, and then after that you're going to consolidate this, produce the findings. Please note, when I talk about qualitative work, I talk about findings. If I talk about quantitative work, I talk about results. It's just some of the rules. So I'm going to find these findings, I'm going to generate the instrument, I'm going to do quantitative work. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to answer the next question, which is, how important is this? So I'm doing a phased design there. 2 phases, you can do multiple phases, qualitative followed by quantitative. I can also say, let me try and find quantitatively where there's problem areas, and then I go second phase, deeply explore it in interviews. So the order in which you're putting those things together and understanding what you want to do will give you a lot of ideas around exactly how are you going to execute your research. It's going to tell you if you're going to use multi-method, because you've already mixed methodologies, because you've already looked at the questions. Is this one coming from there and this one coming from that paradigm? How I'm going to mix it? So you need to be able to put together a strong argument, because your chapter 4, where you're doing the discussion of the results and the findings, drawing them together, is based on this argument. Chapter 4 is not by pressing a button on SPSS and having these wonderful graphs, just thinking that if you put enough graphs together, you're going to convince somebody. It's about pulling together an argument. So if you know what that argument is, actually doing your research becomes that much easier. Okay, so we're trying to get there. And remember, although we talk about the literature review, which is assignment 4, assignment 4, if you do it completely, is the basis or nearly the complete chapter 2. You are not going to put the complete chapter 2 in your proposal, but if you haven't done it thoroughly, you don't know what surprises may await you if you start reading deeper. And most of you have now already found that if you read things, you find more and more and more uncertainty around it, and you actually know where you want to do. So we want you to be much further along with your literature review than what you need to report in your proposal, because it just makes it more likely that you'll be able to do the research successfully. There's no nasty surprises waiting down, lower risk. That's all we want you to do. So if you start doing that, the way that you've structured that, remember there's all these little red stars in the actual presentation that say we want literature here, we want literature there, we want literature there. So the moment you have that structure, you will also know where to be looking for literature and exactly what the structure of your literature review must be. And it's really scary to do a literature review without guidance because you don't know what literature is relevant. So we want to give you a structure that you know this is relevant, and this is relevant for the purposes of my argument. So what's your argument? Please present that. Okay, the next thing is this diagram. Now for those of you that have previously attempted assignment 3, this diagram has on the left a column that says potential questions, and you 1, 2, 3, you just list them there. The next columns are the questions. So if I've put a possible sub-question, I've asked one question in there, my answer to how important it is next to it, yes or no. If I said no, in other words, I'm going to put it outside of my scope, that's the end of this question. If I say yes, it's in my scope, I start asking the following questions there. So I want to ask about this question, is it qualitative, quantitative? Next question, are there ethical concerns and what are they? What's the theoretical grounding? What sources of data exist? And please note there's an extra question in there, so you can just put that extra column in your table. You don't have to, but it might just make your life easier. Around ethical access, are there instruments? Can I develop instruments? Can I do it? And then at the end of this, which is a massive table, and probably you find out it's difficult to print it out on even a A4, you might want to print it out on A3 or whatever. You have an untangled version of what is happening in your study, what you must be looking at. And that's all we're doing. We're trying to get you to untangle the concepts to deal with exactly what it is that's within that question. It's impossible for me to say to anybody what should be in there, but the moment you've started untangling it, it gives me some indication of where there might be something missing. And it's not that I necessarily know your topic areas, it's that I know how to do analysis of what you're presenting to me, that there's a weakness in your argument. And that's all I have to do. I have to find those weaknesses so that they are not there when you present your proposal. Okay. So you make these decisions. Yeah?
The last 3 columns. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Can you give some examples?
Okay. Let's look at it once again. If there is a research instrument about quality, about service quality, ServQual, and then it's okay. Then I don't have to say if I'm going to develop something more. Or it could be, what do you want to measure?
Non-completion.
Okay. Non-completion is not just a good example. Who wants to use a survey anywhere? Who's going to use a questionnaire? What you want to measure?
Effectiveness.
Effectiveness. Okay. Is there an instrument out there that measures the effectiveness exactly and precisely? And preferably it's so much easier if somebody's designed it. Especially at the master's level, you don't want to go around scrubbing. But if you say, no, there isn't, the question is, can I design it? In other words, what would I measure to tell me if it was effective? So, do I have enough background, is enough literature for me to say, if I put the following items in my questionnaire, I will be able to measure it. And remember, you have a window of opportunity with people. Generally, if you just stop somebody and ask them to answer it, How quickly can you do it? 5 minutes may be a long time to talk to somebody if you stop them outside the shopping mall and you ask them how did they actually experience the interaction with the people that helped them in the shop. 5 minutes is already pushing the boundary. Do they have that time? If you're sending an electronic survey, internet on a company, maybe a quarter of an hour if it's really important and they feel interested. And in a quarter of an hour, how many questions can you ask? Sometimes, if those are questions that are straightforward, 20. If it's questions people really have to think about it, 10. So how many questions, and you've got to actually do a pilot study to check how many there are. So when you look at, can I design an instrument? Do I know exactly what I have to ask? And if you don't know, can I find out about it? And it's really important you can find out. But if you can't, if it's really difficult, you may choose not to do that empirically because you don't have those instruments. The next thing is, can I do the research? Maybe you've decided I need to go to the top level of management and I have to have in-depth interviews with them. And even if I have the access, am I going to be confident enough? Am I going to be able to sit there and ask these questions? Or am I not? Do I actually like people enough to ask 500 different people how they feel about something? Am I confident enough for that? And in the next half of the year, at the end, there's going to be sessions given around, let's talk about case study research. And then it's not everybody come in. Anybody that wants to know about case study research will then come into a class and we talk about case study research. So you will be acquiring those competencies. Okay? It may be that you have to use statistics. So you will be acquiring those competencies through a training process or whatever, or reading about it. And a lot of you are reading. I think what was quite interesting is if you think you know everything about a specific way of doing research, a specific method, then start reading about it and you will find out a lot more detail around practically doing that. But that's something that you've got to look at. Okay, this table is simply to have you give those questions. So this tells you what to do about them. And in the following table, you then list it. Delineations, give the questions that you have to delineate. Or state, this is outside of my scope. And you just complete this to show exactly what your results are, or your findings are from your process. I'm going to be making assumptions or just giving definitions about the following things. List them. These things I'm going to answer with my literature. List them. This is my research sub-questions. List them. And you might also find what are the topics that I have to do literature survey on, because you've now unpacked it. Just list those things, because that is the result of your thought processes, your analysis of the research you want to do. We are not, it is really, really difficult to get to a point where you actually, let me get to that thing, where you can actually do that and know what you want to answer if you haven't methodically, painstakingly scratched open and worked out what must you answer. So going quickly to, these are the 3 sub-questions, might mean that you forget certain things, and it will certainly mean that your literature survey will be, or your literature review, sorry, will be difficult. Okay. Is there anybody that want to talk about anything? Let me talk about assignment 3, what it is actually, and then we'll deal with it. Yeah?
At that tree, what would be the ideal number of questions?
Research sub-questions, it's still within 3 to 5. But you now have to take into account how much would it take to answer this question. Would answering this question mean countrywide surveys? So your decision about which one you're going to answer is seriously impacted by what method are you going to follow to answer that question. Or in some cases, I want to answer this question, but I'm using a qualitative framework. But I'm going to use more than one method. I'm going to do interviews. I'm going to do focus groups. And I'm going to do some content analysis of documents. And I'm using more than one method to be able to triangulate so that I have a finding. Okay. So if I'm going to use 3, 4 different methods, I might end up with one only empirical question. So this is a trade-off study. Guidelines 3 to 5, it depends on how much effort, how much depth, how many methods within are you going to use to answer that. Sometimes you can have 3 separate sub-questions, okay, especially if you start, okay, qualitative or quantitative, but you use interviews, and in that interview you have the evidence, the data that enables you to answer all 3. So you may not have different instruments per sub-question. Sometimes you have one instrument per sub-question. Sometimes you have more than one instrument per sub-question. All of that will determine how many you can deal with. In many cases, in a quantitative, when you do a large-scale survey, what you're trying to do is you're trying to test all of your, but remember, you've taken your sub-question there to change it to a hypothesis so you can answer it statistically. You want to test all of those hypotheses, preferably with a single survey, especially if it's a large-scale survey. Now you've got to work out, how many items am I going to be able to fit into this questionnaire so that people will actually still answer it? How many hypotheses can I use there? Okay.
And believe me, you don't want to learn the hard way like I did, that people are not going to spend 3 hours completing your questionnaire.
Just because it's important to you doesn't mean it's important to them. And you can't go around bribing them. Remember the ethics? You can't go around buying their time. Maybe buying their time, but rewarding them for it. So you can't go around buying your evidence. Okay. Or fabricating it. Fabricating it is another sin altogether. Remember, you have to actually state in your proposal that that primary data, depending on the coding and the ethics around it, will be kept for 5 years. That's a commitment you've got to, that must be there, and it must be kept for 5 years. It's part of the ethics of doing research. Not the ethics about acquiring data, but doing research and reporting on research. So you can't go around fabricating it. You can't go around closing the door on your students and say, okay guys, nobody leaves this room until you finish this. Temptation is sometimes massive, isn't it? Okay, people that do not give me this survey will not get their final marks or equivalent kind of things. You can't go around it. So the practicality of how you'll be going around answering that sub-question, proving or disproving the hypothesis, actually the hypothesis you disprove, will determine how many can you handle in the study. And either your supervisor or the nasty witch will go around and tell you, this scope is too big. Do you want to do 1, 2, or 3 degrees? And that's that's why we get so tense about your scope. It's because we want you to, who of you have not yet heard that? So there's a lot of people here that had that question, you know, how many degrees do you want? And the guidance is to make sure that you can actually do that. We don't want you to spend the next 5 years trying to answer to get 1 degree. It's, you know, you can do it if you want to. We're not going to stop you, but it's going to be really, really difficult from our perspective ethically to get you to get approved to do this research if we can see that it's not achievable within the time frame.
So remember, the DRIC and the FHBC have the responsibility to make sure that we don't set students up for failure. And so if your proposal comes back from the FHBC saying that you must limit your scope, it's because people don't want to set you up for failure. And that's also, you know, and I think that the one thing that I was thinking about is that you must remember that the whole research process is a frustrating process and is a process where you have to redo and redo and redo.
That cyclical thing, you go through it over and over and over.
And I was talking to a very, very, very experienced researcher the other day. But okay, he's very anal retentive. But he said to me that the last paper that he submitted to an international journal for peer review had 87 revisions between him and his co-authors before it was submitted to that journal. Okay, and he is a full professor. So I just want to show you that what you're going through now is what you will be going through your whole life if you remain in research. Okay.
It's just about checking, 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 and checking again. And please remember about these revision things. If you've had it in assignment 1 and you redo assignment 1, please put a little note on that document that this is version 2 or this date, because otherwise you get really confused and you can't remember what one was the last one. Or, I mean, I've got 10 documents with the same name. Which one am I actually talking about? Typically it helps to put little brackets on it, version 1, version 2, version 3, so that you actually can trace them, or you can put the date or something like that, because it's very, very painful to try and work, okay, which one, where's the differences, where did I change that last thing, or working with the older one and suddenly finding out that your changes have disappeared.
Okay, sorry, just the last one. I can show you on my computer, on my PhD, it started with final June, then it was final July, and then it was final August. So, you know, even at that phase, I thought that it was final, but every time it went to the supervisors, it came back with changes. And so then there's one that says final PDF, and that's the final one. But you will see that there's 3 months of finals before I got to the final.
So but please try and keep track. So what assignment 3 is about is saying at least 20 questions, but please don't think that 20 is always enough. Typically between 20 and 30 shows that you should be achieving saturation. It doesn't mean that that's enough. Scratch them open as deeply as you possibly can. At the doctoral level, make dead sure, because your process of getting examined is more intense. People will be looking deeper for faults. The requirement from NQF level is that you really have to be dealing with all of the theoretical arguments. Where at the master's level, you've got to know what's going on. You've got to be at the cutting edge. At a doctoral level, you've got to really, really know what's cooking. So 20 is just a guideline. Start off with the questions, what do you mean by every term? Okay. Then, and remember the one on my tutor doesn't have that one cell, you can just add it if you want to. Okay, part 2, and this is the fun and game now. Sit down and do a self-reflection. And we want that in for you to be able to say, because it's very strange. I mean, you might be feeling really, really scared and upset now. Do you remember how much you knew when you started here? How far it is? It's very important for you to look at what you are doing there, to see what feedback you got, to understand what the value there is, and to be realistic about what has been going on. The big concern with the doctoral work is that when you start, you know this is new work. By the time you hand it in, you can't see why this is in any way new work, because you know everything about it. You've been living with this thing deeply all the time, so everything is just so boring, so obvious. And it's difficult to remember that it's actually some level of contribution. So it's very useful to keep reflections so that when you really get desperate, you know from where you came. And you will get desperate.
So would you please reiterate what you said about the conversion of questions into hypotheses?
Okay. The conversion of questions into hypothesis. A research question or sub-question is put into a frame such as, what is the impact between this? What is the impact of, say, variable 1 on variable 2? When you state a hypothesis, because okay, statistically, all you want to do is you want to say, this is not true. You just want to have one thing that says it's not true, then you know it's not true. So you're trying to disprove, you're really trying to say, this is wrong. So what you put in a hypothesis, and this is where it starts to unpack, you might have a hypothesis that say, factor 1 has a positive influence on factor 2. Okay. And you may want to say something that factor 1 has no impact. Factor 1 has a negative impact. So your statement, and we'll deal with that later, but a hypothesis is really stating that a possible answer to your question that you want to disprove. You never prove an hypothesis, you fail to disprove it. That's all. So you're trying to disprove it. If you can't disprove it, you are, with some level of certainty, you can say it's true. So changing a research question into an hypothesis is trying to get, say, this is the answer, yes or no, not yes or no, not no, this is the answer, not no, this is the answer, not no. And if I have, and sometimes you phrase it into those 3 options. So you try and find out which ones you can disprove, then you have more certainty that the ones you can't disprove is true. You can have a research proposition. Okay, so what you're trying to say there, you're trying to explain precisely, it's positivist research. So the whole way that you're trying to deal with positivist research is it's true despite its context. A research proposition is the same thing, a sort of answer to your research question, but that guides qualitative work, but the more positivist side of qualitative work. But if you don't have your research question, your sub-question, you cannot translate that into a hypothesis.
So, in terms of proposition, you need to have one or do you have to have many?
Same thing with a hypothesis. In every textbook they will tell you, are you going to set a hypothesis and a null hypothesis? Or are you going to about setting a hypothesis, an alternative hypothesis, and an alternative hypothesis? There are very many ways that you can go about it. None of them are the way. Your supervisor and the way that it's done before, if you're doing a master's, the way that has been done in other would give you a guide of what would be appropriate in your circumstance. I can't say this is the way, but people, if you deal with that, what you sit with is our missing colleague from the statistics department. The moment you start pulling together hypotheses, you go to him. Can this be done? There are so many variables and issues in there, it's very difficult for me to tell you this is a solution. A proposition, you have to have the same thing. Do I have the methods to prove or disprove that proposition? Once again, when you have a proposition, what you're trying to do is you want to fail to disprove it. Not to prove it, to fail to disprove it. But the research question, you are looking at understanding, describing, and a hypothesis or a proposition, you are trying to go around explaining exactly what's happening. It's just, but every single research methodology textbook will tell you something different. Every single person that teach quantitative research methods will tell you something different. And they all will tell you, this is the road to your red robe. Permanent. It's not true. There are many ways to skin a cat. In your interest, finding the way that your supervisor and previous work indicated the cat will stay skinned and you will get your degree. Okay. So, okay, I'm not going to skin cats around here. Okay, and that is the whole way. Getting to objectives, that's just all that you're doing with getting to objectives. Your empirical objectives, and we'll unpack that later, is your sub-question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, and your primary research question. Your literature objectives are answering your literature questions and the knowledge underlying your ability to answer your research or your empirical objectives. Okay, anybody not feeling confused and unhappy? Was this much clearer to you than the first time I did this? And it's not because I explained it differently. It's just because you are now at a point that you have delved deeply enough that you can engage with it. But we have to, very often you have to repeat these sessions until you actually feel comfortable and you actually understand the complexities, because if I just explained to you, you would think it's easy to do. But if you start doing it, you find out why it's not that easy.
I just want to, sorry, I'm taking you back. I just want to just clarify for me, content analysis, value theory, and empirical research, those three aspects.
Okay. Empirical research is research where you're gathering evidence, not something that you're not getting what everybody else, you're gathering evidence to address a research sub-question. That is empirical research. Now you may be gathering that evidence through many, you could even use secondary data in some case, whatever, or you can do, I know of people that did a content analysis of advertisements on what people require of project management to try and find out what the skills are. You can do that. Okay. If you start dealing with, the next thing was? Content analysis. In content analysis, you are going through descriptives. Okay. That descriptive can in fact be graphic. It could be a diagram, and you have different diagrams or different paintings, and you try and see what's in there. And when you do content analysis, you have two ways. You can either say from the beginning, have this instrument, that I'm going to look at that and find out how do people deal, are people talking about things that talk about rage? Are people talking about things that talk about unhappiness? Are people, and you have those things, so you have themes, and you go and look through the content and you code. And you can do descriptive statistics with that. You can say, okay, this is the percentage of times, so many times occur, all kinds of statistics. Or you can say, I'm reading through this and I'm finding emergent themes. I don't know what it is, but if you want to identify possible factors, you go there and you start looking for emergent themes and you analyze it. Sometimes you have this in a cycle. First go through them, look for emergent themes, then go through everything and code it according to that thematic structure. That's content analysis. If you look at grounded theory process is really fun and games. If you feel like it, let's go there. But what you do there, and in many cases it is the only way that you can go around dealing with a lot of context-driven research. In grounded theory, you're basically saying, this is what I'm finding. Now let me look at the theoretical underpinnings so that I can actually say what I've said, is it theoretically acceptable? Can I phrase a new theory? There's a number of things you can actually do, but in full grounded research, if you grounded theory research, it's about going through, I find these things. Now let me look at the theory, find out what it means, and try and work out, I now have a new explanation for something. I am developing a new theory. Okay. In case study, you could also, case study research enables you to do theory building. Yeah. But it is a fairly extensive process, and it is quite difficult to prove, because now you want to prove to people this and this and this, I therefore propose that this is the reasons. So doctoral level you can go there, master's level try to avoid it. You can go there if you're comfortable with it. You can go there if your supervisor is really comfortable with it and can provide you guidance. But be serious about that decision.
Don't lie on the bed until the feeling goes away.
But if it's the way you go, please, let the two of us not say anything. The two of us, both of us, did qualitative research in engineering, and we have the scars to prove it. But now we can say, and I didn't do the hand signal either, although I was really tempted. Okay, is there anything else you want to address? Are you feeling comfortable? Are you feeling a little bit more certain about what has to happen?
Doc, can I just ask one more last thing, please? I heard you in the presentation you were saying the same words that are in your title must be in your program and your objectives.
Yeah.
I get to a point where I feel like I'm repeating the same thing like so many times.
You will.
Isn't that normal in these situations?
That is normal, because that's a golden thread. Your title has to reflect what is happening in there. Your problem tells you what are you going to be working on. And your objectives tell you what are you going to be doing. So they have to all have. It feels, especially in your proposal where they're all close, it feels if you're repeating it. That is your golden thread. If you start using different words there, people get confused. You don't want people confused. You don't want to surprise them. You don't want to get them confused. You want to make it logical, clear to follow. Everybody feels happy. That is one of the ways to the red rope. Okay, guys. See you.